We moved to the lab for computational vision at NYU, as the tools developed in vision are also useful for understanding sound and hearing. He's still working on sound and will be for the foreseeable future. So thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Gustavo, and for Mathieu for organizing this and inviting me here. So the work that I'll be talking about today is joint work with Ircam and Shelley, who's also at New York University. So the work that I'll be talking about really starts with sort of a larger question of how we recognize sounds. That's both relevant for understanding auditory perception and for understanding how we would get machines to recognize sounds. So the problem, of course, is that the ear receives a pressure waveform, but as a listener, you're not really interested in the sound waveform per se. You're interested in what happened in the world to cause the sound. That is, whether it was a dog or a train or rain or people singing or what have you. And so our perceptual processes have to transform the sensory input that enters the ear into representations that are useful for behavior by making the things that happen in the world explicit. So to try to understand aspects of how we do this, we've spent a lot of time over the past few years thinking a lot about one particular class of sounds, namely sound textures. So textures are sounds that result from large numbers of acoustic events. They're analogous to the visual textures, like this image of bark here, that have been studied for decades in vision. And they include lots of things that you hear all the time, like the sound of rain, wind, birds, running water, insects, and so forth. So these are sounds that are very common in the world. It seems likely that they're important for a lot of things that humans have to do and maybe that machines have to do, like figure out where you are or what the weather's like or what have you. But unlike the situation in vision, these things have been largely unstudied. So we're interested in them in part because we think that they illustrate aspects of one of the key problems of recognition. That is the problem of invariance. All right, so just to make this concrete, consider this excerpt here. And now listen to this. So it's obvious to you that those are the same kind of thing. In fact, you might not have even really been able to tell that they were different. In fact, they're two different excerpts of the same texture, the waveform of which is just plotted below. So you can see that the waveforms are completely different. But as a listener, you can tell that they're the same kind of thing. And so that's really what we're after here. The question is, what is it that you extract and store about these waveforms in your memory, for instance, that allows you to recognize that they're the same kind of thing and that allows you to match them to some stored representation in your memory to understand that, oh yeah, that was a bunch of people talking. So why study this with texture? Well, consider something that's not a texture.
January.
All right, so this is just the sound of a word, and you can see here this is again the waveform. Well, the word's got a beginning, it's got an end, and it's got some kind of temporal evolution, and that temporal evolution is a large part of what makes that word the word, and when you recognize the word, you have to do something to recognize that temporal evolution. Consider in contrast the sound of rain. Now, of course, at some point the rain started, and hopefully at some point it'll end, but the start and the end are not what makes it sound like rain. Right? The qualities that make it sound like rain are just there. So we call that stationarity. That is, the essential properties don't change over time. So we think that stationarity makes textures a particularly good starting point for understanding auditory representation because it kind of simplifies the things that you have to worry about. You don't have to deal with time in quite the same way. So there's been some previous work on modeling sound texture. This is not a completely exhaustive list, but there hasn't been a whole lot of work done on this. There's also, of course, a lot of work on environmental sounds that's often inclusive of texture. And the work that we're doing, I think, is distinct from these approaches in that we're really interested in how this might be done in biological auditory systems. So we're interested in representations that have some degree of biological plausibility. So the key proposal of the work that I'll be telling you about is that because textures are stationary, we think they can be captured by statistics that are just time averages of acoustic measurements. So the notion is that because the important properties don't change over time, if you make informative measurements and then just average them over time, that ought to tell you something about what kind of sound it is. So the proposal is that when you recognize the sound of fire or the sound of rain, you're recognizing these summary statistics of their properties. And the claim in particular that I would make is that whatever statistics the auditory system might be measuring are presumably derived from peripheral auditory representations. Because whenever your brain does the interesting things that we do with sound, it's making use of input from those peripheral representations. And so it makes sense to think about what those representations are like and what the statistics would be of those representations. So all of the work that I'll be talking about is rooted in various models of biological auditory systems. And so I'll just quickly walk you through the particular model that this work is based in. So everybody here knows that the sound signal that enters the ear we can think of as being filtered by the cochlea. So you can think of the cochlea as consisting of a bunch of bandpass filters. This would be the frequency response. This is a low frequency filter and a high frequency filter. And so you can think of the output as of the cochlea as a subband decomposition of the original broadband signal, where this is a low frequency subband that wiggles at a slow rate. This is a high frequency subband that wiggles at a fast rate. Now everybody also knows that a lot of the important information in these subbands is carried in the way that their amplitude is modulated over time. And we can measure that amplitude with what we always refer to as the envelope. So we'll extract the envelope and be making measurements of that. Now one other important thing that happens in the cochlea is amplitude compression. So the response that you get to a very high amplitude sound is less than you would expect given the response to a low amplitude sound. And it's as though the sound has been passed through a compressive nonlinearity. So we apply this compressive nonlinearity to the envelopes to get a compressed envelope that gives you some measure of the amplitude of the sound as a function of time within that frequency channel. Now there's one last stage of processing that goes into this model that's important, and that is a modulation filter bank. So this is a very old idea in hearing. At this point there's a fair bit of evidence from this from psychoacoustics as well as from neurophysiology. And the idea is that you can take a bank of filters and apply it to the envelope instead of the original sound waveform. And so these things are conceptually very similar to the filtering that we think occurs at the level of the cochlea, the main difference being that they're tuned to frequencies that are about an order of magnitude lower. And that's because the envelope tends to fluctuate at pretty slow rates. So the output of these filters are what we call modulation bands. In this case, this is a low frequency filter, and so you can see this thing fluctuates very slowly. This is a higher frequency filter, and so it fluctuates more rapidly. And you can think of these modulation filters as capturing some of the behavior that we observe in subcortical auditory neurons, for instance, in regions like the inferior colliculus or the thalamus. All right, so the question that we're after is how much of texture perception can be captured with simple summary statistics of these representations. Now, the key methodological proposal of what I'm going to tell you about is that synthesis is a powerful way to test a perceptual theory. Now, why would this be? Well, the idea is that if your brain represents sounds with some set of measurements, then all the signals that have the same values of those measurements ought to sound the same. And in particular, if we synthesize sounds so that they have the same measurements as some real-world recording, well, then those synthetic sounds ought to sound like another example of that real-world recording if the measurements that we use to do the synthesis are like the ones that the brain uses to represent sounds. And so we've applied this approach to sound textures. So the basic idea is to take an example signal like a recording of rain or fire or whatever, measure some statistics from that signal, and then synthesize new signals, constraining them only to have those same statistics. So this approach is inspired by work that was done about 15 years ago in visual texture synthesis, some of the key names of which are displayed here. I should also say that this is not the first example that I know of in which synthesis was really used to understand perception. I think we learned a lot about hearing from work that was done on instrument synthesis, some of which was done around here. I guess the distinction between what we're doing and some of the instrument synthesis work is we're really interested in doing synthesis from quantities that we measure in biologically plausible representations, whereas the people doing instrument synthesis usually weren't as interested in that. All right, so how can we synthesize sounds in this way? So remember that the auditory model that I talked about starts with this subband transform, where you take your broadband input sound signal and you split it up into a bunch of subbands. So that's just depicted here. You have a signal, it gets passed through about 30 bandpass filters, and so you get a whole bunch of different versions of that signal that contain frequencies in some region of the spectrum. So we're going to take advantage of the fact that if we take those subbands and we add them back up, if we've chosen the filter bank in the right way, if we add up the subbands, we'll get back exactly the same thing that we started with, namely a regular old sound signal. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start out with a noise signal, because we want to start with something that's as random as possible. We're going to split it up into its subband representation, and then we're going to alter the subbands so as to cause them to have the desired statistics that we'll measure in a real-world sound. We'll then add up the subbands to get a new sound, and we're going to listen to it and see what it sounds like. So here's just a simple example to illustrate the logic and the methodology. So let's suppose that we wanted to test the role of a very simple statistic. And the simple statistic in this case will just be the average value of each cochlear envelope. So the average of the envelope of a particular channel will tell you roughly how much power is in that channel. And so collectively, the average of each of the envelopes of each of the channels, and remember we have about 30 of them, will help us characterize the power spectrum. So lots of people think that the power spectrum is an important property of sounds, and you might think that different textures are distinguished in part by having different power spectra. So maybe it's not such an implausible notion. So the way that we would test that idea in this framework is to start out with some real-world sound like this, process it in our model, take each of the envelopes of the subbands of this sound and measure their average value. So we'd have 30 numbers representing the sound. And now we want to synthesize a random signal that has those same envelope mean values. So in this case, it's obviously very easy to do. We start out with a sample of noise, we generate its subbands, and we just rescale the subbands so that their envelopes have the correct average value. We then add them back up, and we get a new signal. And we'll then listen to it and see what it sounds like. And so if the power spectrum theory of texture is correct, these synthetic signals ought to sound like examples of the real thing. So what do they sound like? Well, unfortunately, they basically sound like noise. So again, this is noise that was adjusted so as to have the same power in each channel as in this case a recording of rain, stream, bubbles, and so forth. Whereas it's supposed to sound like Alright, so the synthesis in this case is not realistic. Everything just sounds like noise. And so what this tells us is that as listeners, well, our brains are not simply registering the spectrum when we recognize textures. So the question is whether additional simple statistics will do any better. And so we've examined things that are just a little bit more complicated than the average value of different parts of this representation. We've investigated how far we can get with marginal moments, so in addition to the mean, the variance, and the skew of, for instance, the envelopes here and of the modulation bands, as well as pairwise correlations. So we've looked at correlations between envelopes of different channels, as well as between different pairs of modulation bands. So these statistics are generic. They're things that everyone knows about. They're not tailored to any specific natural sound, but they're simple and they're easy to measure. On the other hand, it's not obvious that they would account for much of sound recognition because of this simplicity. But we thought maybe they would be a reasonable place to start. So for these kinds of statistics to be useful for recognition, well, at a minimum, they have to yield different values for different types of sounds. And so just to give you some intuition for what kinds of information you could capture with simple measures like this, I'll show you a few examples of this. So let's first look at the marginal moments of the envelopes. So the marginal moments are things that will describe the distribution of the envelope. So remember, the envelopes are the things that make up a spectrogram. You can think of a slice through a spectrogram as a single envelope. It's this red curve here. And the moments that we're talking about are things that would characterize the distribution you would get if you collapsed the envelope over time to form a histogram that would give you the frequency of occurrence of different amplitudes of the envelope. And so in this particular case, you can see that most of the time the envelope has some moderate value, but sometimes it's higher and sometimes it's lower. Now, obviously, when you do this business of collapsing across time, you're throwing out a lot of information and you get a very impoverished representation. And it's not at all obvious that this would capture anything interesting or useful about sounds. But it turns out that when you look at these kinds of distributions across a wide set of sounds, you see something interesting. And that is that the envelope distributions for natural signals often differ from each other, and they generally differ qualitatively from what you observe with noise. So this is the same thing that I just showed you here, only rotated 90 degrees. So we have the probability of occurrence of different magnitudes of the envelope. And these three distributions here are for three different sounds. In each case, I'm plotting the histogram of the envelope of one particular channel, in this case the one that's centered at 2200 Hertz. So the red is a pink noise signal, the blue is a stream, and the green is geese. And the thing to note about this is that although the average value of the envelopes of these three sounds is the same in this case, so that's indicated by these vertical bars, the distributions have got very different shapes. So you can see that the stream and the geese have histograms that are more spread out for one thing. You also probably notice that although the noise distribution is tilted a little bit one way, the stream and the geese are tilted in the other direction. Now if you look at the spectrograms, you can kind of see that this is where this comes from. So the spectrogram of the pink noise is mostly gray. And so what that means is that the noise amplitudes spend most of their time around the average value, whereas the stream has got more black and more white. In this case, white is down here and black is up here, and the geese has got a lot more white and a lot more black. So there's more extreme values. So these behaviors are examples of the common observation that natural signals tend to be what we call sparser than noise. Now the intuition is that natural sounds like rain contain events like raindrops or geese calls, and although these events are infrequent, when they occur they produce large amplitudes, and when they don't occur the amplitude tends to be low. And the convenient thing about sparsity is that it's a property that differentiates all these signals, but it seems to be reflected in relatively simple statistics. For instance, the variance that tells you how spread out these distributions are, as well as the skew, which tells you which way they're tilted. Okay, so that's sort of a brief description of what some of the marginal moments capture. I'm going to briefly also tell you, give you an example of the correlations that you can observe between different envelopes of different cochlear channels. So these correlations are statistics that also vary quite a bit across sounds, and the variation is due in part to the presence or absence of broadband events. So if you listen to the sound of fire, you can hear that fire's got a lot of crackles and pops and clicks. And when those crackles and pops and clicks occur, they excite all of the different cochlear channels at once because they're broadband events, and you can see them in the spectrogram as vertical streaks. So that introduces dependencies between the channels, and you can measure those just by computing correlations between the envelopes of the different channels. And those are shown here for fire. So this is a matrix of correlation coefficients where every square represents the correlation between a pair of cochlear channels going from low frequency to high and low to high. So the diagonal's got to be 1, but the off diagonals can be anything. And you can see for fire there's a lot of red and a lot of yellow, and that means that the correlations tend to be large and positive. And that's the case for a lot of sounds, but not for all. For a stream, for instance, the correlations are much lower, close to 0 for different subbands. And that just means that streams don't have a whole lot of broadband events. So the point of these two examples is just to illustrate that although these statistics are fairly simple and generic, they do capture variation across sound, and so in principle they could be useful for recognizing sounds. So our interest is whether they'll really capture the sound of real-world textures. So again, the strategy is to synthesize a signal, constraining it only to have the same statistics as some real-world sound. So we're going to start with noise and then try to adjust it so as to cause it to have the desired statistics. So in this case, it's a little bit more complicated than simply adjusting it so that the spectrum is matched. And so the basic idea of the method, which I won't go into in great detail, is to adjust the subband envelopes with gradient descent. And so the idea is that the statistics are all functions of the envelope, and so we can compute their gradient with respect to the envelope. And we can then change the envelope of each of the subbands in the gradient direction until the statistic matches the desired value. And so we devised a method to do that. It's described in more detail in this paper that's indicated down there. This is a simple flow chart of the way that things work. So we start with an original sound of interest, like a recording of rain. We process it through the auditory model, extract the envelopes of the subbands, measure the statistics that are of interest. We then take a white noise signal, we process it through the same model, measure its statistics, and then we use the difference between the statistics of the noise and the statistics of the original sound as an error signal that drives the gradient descent. And we use the gradient descent to impose the statistics of the original on the noise signal to get new envelopes, which we then combine with the original fine structure to get new subbands. And then this process is done iteratively, and over time the statistics of the noise converge to those of the original so that we get this synthetic sound. So the result of this is a sound signal that we generated from noise that shares the statistics of a real-world sound. And we can then listen to them and see what they sound like. So again, the reason we're doing this is that if the statistics that we impose on the noise signal account for our perception of texture, well, then the synthetic signals should sound like new examples of the real thing. And in many cases, they do. So these are examples of the sound synthesis, again, all of which were generated from noise just by matching the statistics of, in this case, rain, stream, bubbling, fire, applause, wind, insects, birds, and crowd noise. All right, so it often works pretty well. One important point is that the synthesis doesn't simply recreate the original sound. So these are just examples of spectrograms of the original sounds and synthetic versions. If you just look at the geese example, you can see that the peaks in amplitude are in different places, and you don't get the same thing. Moreover, because the procedure is initialized with noise, it produces a different sound signal every time that share only the statistical properties. So here are three spectrograms of examples of waves that were synthesized from the same set of statistics. And again, you can see visually that they're physically distinct. So the idea here is that the statistics define a class of sounds that include the original, but also many others. And when you do the synthesis, you're generating one of these other sounds. And the idea is that if the statistics measure what the brain is measuring, well, then the samples ought to sound like another example of the original sound because they're part of sort of a perceptual equivalence class. And we find that in a lot of cases they do. So it also works for a lot of unnatural sounds. Here's rustling paper and a jackhammer and so forth. And so there's other examples of this on my webpage if you're interested. Okay, so we did some experiments to verify that these things sound the way that they should. In this experiment, we asked people to identify a 5-second sound clip that was either the real thing or a synthetic version synthesized with different statistics. So they had to identify it from 5 choices. Chance performance is 20%. If you do the simplest thing of just matching the spectrum, people are above chance but not very good. But as you add in more statistics to the synthesis, people get better and better until they're almost as good as the originals. So that's consistent with the idea that these simple statistics can support the recognition of real-world textures. Now you might be wondering, though, well, maybe it's just the case that any sufficiently large set of statistics will do. And in particular, we wanted to know, well, what will happen if we measure statistics from a model that deviates from what we know about biology? So recall that all of this stuff is rooted in this auditory model that has these 3 stages of processing. And we can take each of these 3 stages and mess with it so as to make it less consistent with what we know about the auditory system. So in the case of the filters, our filter banks were roughly log-spaced, like the ones that you see in the ear, where the low-frequency filters are narrower on a linear scale than the high-frequency filters. And we can swap that out with a filter bank that's linearly spaced. So same number of filters, but the frequency distribution is different. We can also get rid of this compressive nonlinearity or make the same modification to the modulation filter bank. So we did an experiment where we played people the original and then 2 synthetic sounds, one of which was synthesized from the biologically plausible model and one from the non-biological model. So there were 4 different conditions, one where we got rid of compression, one where we made the cochlea linearly spaced, one where we made the modulation filter bank linearly spaced, and one where we did all 3. And if these things all are equally good, people will be at chance and they'll be at 50%, but what we find is that in every case, people say that the synthesis from the biologically plausible model is more realistic. And so that indicates that not all statistics are created equally. The synthesis really only works well when you use things that the brain itself might plausibly be using. All right. One final thing that I'll conclude with, this is the result of an experiment where we played people the original and then a synthetic version. We asked them to rate the realism on a scale of 1 to 7. And we did this for a very large set of 170 different textures. So this is just a histogram of the realism ratings that you get for each sound. The 2 things you should take away from this are, 1, well, there's a big bump up here at the top. That's good because it means the synthesis works pretty well in a lot of sounds. But there's also this tail down here. All right, so these are interesting because these are synthetic sounds that are statistically matched to the originals, according to the statistics in our model, and yet people are telling us that they don't sound anything like them. And that's very interesting to us as hearing scientists because that means that the brain is measuring something that's not in our model, and it points us to something that we don't understand. This is a list of the sounds that get the lowest rating, and just to make life easy on you, I've labeled them here because they tend to fall into roughly 3 classes. That is, sounds that contain pitch, sounds that contain rhythm, and sounds that have reverberation. And I'll just play you a couple of examples, first of the original and then of the synthetic version. Here's a railroad crossing, and here's the synthetic version. All right, so it's terrible. This is a simple tapping rhythm, and the synthetic. So there are taps in there, but the rhythm information is lost. There's we're in France, so this is someone speaking French.
Le forçat s'est évadé du bagne. Une grosse poutre maintient la misérable.
And the synthetic version. All right. So this is an interesting. These are very interesting to us, and we can talk more about this if people are interested. But it tells us that there are things about perception that we haven't quite figured out, and gives us a way to maybe move forward. So just to quickly summarize, we find that naturalistic sounds can be generated from relatively simple statistics of early auditory representations, things like marginal moments and pairwise correlations of cochlear and modulation filters. And we think this means that similar statistics could be extracted by the auditory system and used for recognition, and that potentially these would also be useful in machine systems. One other point to leave you with is that these relatively simple time average statistics capture a form of invariance, and that we're characterizing all the different exemplars of a particular texture with one set of measurements, and doing so in a way that seems to be consistent with perception. Finally, the last thing that I showed you indicates that vocalizations and some other sounds seem to implicate more sophisticated statistics that we don't yet understand. And finally, one general point, I think, is that synthesis is a powerful and useful tool for studying perception that maybe is underutilized. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
So, any questions? Geoffrey?
Thank you for your great presentation. It was really very interesting. You already noticed that it's kind of difficult to use the same synthesis model for non-stationary sounds. Do you have any vision how to extend this theory to non-stationary and also this kind of more in the direction of instrumental sounds going away? Yeah,
so this is something that I'm kind of starting to think about, and maybe we'll do some work on. The idea is that for textures, because they're stationary, it makes sense to characterize them with a measure that just averages over the full length of the signal, or over some fairly large time window. And that doesn't make sense for non-stationary sounds, because what's happening here is not the same thing as what's happening here. But what you could imagine doing is computing very similar measures, but over time windows of varying durations. So if you measure those statistics over a short time window of, say, a few hundred milliseconds, you would then have a trajectory of statistics over time that would characterize some aspects of the way that the sound changes. And I think that there's a lot of non-stationary sounds that you could kind of think of as sort of sequences of little bits of texture whose statistics would then change over time, and perhaps looking at those trajectories through the space of statistics would be informative about what the nature of the sound is. And I don't know how useful that would be for instruments, but I think there's a lot of different sounds that might profitably be characterized in that way. But it's just an idea at this point. I haven't really done anything.
No, it was first. Sorry. No.
You are Cedric. I'm Geoffroy, actually. First, it sounds very close. Will your slide be available? Do you intend to collect the slide and of the presentation?
Yeah,
okay. So that was not my question, but
I forgot. Yeah, the paper on this stuff just came out, and so all of these figures and stuff are in that paper. It's on my webpage, so you can get that and much more. But.
Nice. So my question was related. You somehow try to capture the interrelation between the temporal evolution of the energy in the various frequency bands using covariance matrices and correlation, and then you had some limitation at the end with the rhythm, for example, to take the case of pitch. So somehow all that belong to a problem of relative phase relation between the energy evolution over time. So have you somehow think about using directly a kind of phase relation between the various bands instead of just doing statistics over autocorrelation, because then you will be able to, of course it will be too sophisticated to represent sound like rain sound, but on the other side you won't have any problem for speech, not speech, for rhythm.
Yeah, so there is actually, so one of the correlations in the model captures the phase relations between different modulation frequencies. So if I go back to, so if you compute a correlation between this modulation band and this modulation band, it's not a straightforward correlation, but you compute the correlation after you adjust the phase of the low frequency guys so that they oscillate at the same rate. You do this in the analytic domain. You can get something that tells you about the phase relations between this, and so it can distinguish between abrupt onsets and abrupt offsets, for instance. So it tells you something about temporal asymmetries. So that's in there. It may not be exactly the right way of doing that, and it may not work well. For rhythms, you may have to do something on a larger time scale. It's an interesting question as to what is responsible for all these different failures, and there's probably different things in different cases. For rhythms, you may need something more like sort of second-order modulation, so modulation of modulation. And reverb is another sort of interesting case where you have a very particular kind of temporal asymmetry typically, and it wasn't obvious a priori that these things were going to turn out as bad as they did. But it's kind of interesting that was the case. I will just show you one other thing here. So these are some synthetic, some toy examples where this is spectrograms of an original sound and then the synthetic version. So this is just bursts of noise, where it's noise modulated with a square wave, right? And so you can see that the synthetic version basically looks about right. So you get the sort of right kind of periodic modulation with abrupt edges in it and so forth. And if you do the same thing to a complex tone, that also roughly turns out right, but of course the spectrum is just stationary. If you have a complex tone whose pitch varies from tone to tone, you can see then the synthesis doesn't work. All right? So the things that you get don't really have clear harmonic relations. So that's just something that kind of gets lost. And you need some sort of higher order statistic to capture that. And this is another example where you have a slightly complicated rhythm of a long burst alternated with two short. And again, the synthesis, you can see some things that are common with the original, right? But you don't have that same clear temporal relation. So some kind of higher order modulation statistic is needed for that. But we did try some simple things with phase, and that wasn't enough.
Okay.
I was wondering if you try to play with the distribution of the input noise in the synthesis. You use white noise. Is this Gaussian noise?
Yeah.
Did you try to use more sparse input sequences?
I haven't played with it in great detail. I have just for fun tried, putting in like a real sound instead of noise to see if any traces of the thing are left. In most of the cases, I can't hear anything. I haven't exhaustively looked at it, but you can give it like a spoken word, and it doesn't seem to make much difference to the end product. So the statistics really end up altering enough of the sound that I don't think it makes a huge difference.
Here at the front.
Okay, well, you said this hasn't been studied much. That's actually kind of true. There's one side.
I'll just ask you if you could, it's not for a fancy thing because we are recording, otherwise your voice doesn't get in the recording,
Okay.
so that's why. Thank you.
Well, there's been quite a bit of work with the soundscape people, such as Daniel Dubois.
Yeah, so that comment was mostly about perception, not so much about modeling and so forth. But yeah.
Well, okay, there's more work on perception, but most of it's been from a sort of source filter model, where what's causing these statistics is actually the physics of the sound producing events. And there's a few different types of sound producing events, and impacts and and those are the things that tend to generate the statistics. So I would think that a more profitable way would be to take the the types of statistics that are generated by these events, and I think Attias and Schreier did that. That paper from about 2001.
Yeah, I know well. Yeah.
Yeah. So they looked at that. They found the fairly reliable statistics for different types of events. So I think that would be, probably a better way of looking of determining what the statistics are, because that's what we listen for in the world.
So I think one of the interesting implications of this is that it suggests that, when we are recognizing textures, we might well be doing something that's completely ignorant of the physics. That is, these are sort of simple statistics that, as you state, don't really say anything about the generative process. And yet, in many cases, they seem to be enough to completely capture the way that we hear them. Now, it doesn't show that we... And I think there are cases where we are inferring something about the generative process, but maybe textures are a case where the generative process is so complicated, there's so many of these events, that really something simpler that is sort of ignorant of the physical causes might be more reflective of what we do.
Some things like fire you can generate with a fairly simple model, physical model, fire sounds and water sounds.
All I'm stating is that these statistics, they don't know anything about physics, right? I mean, it's all kind of implicit. And so it may well be the case that our auditory system also doesn't really know anything about physics. I mean, that remains to be tested, and I think that's not true in every case. But textures may be an instance where you really don't need to go down that route. So.
We'll have one more question now.
Yeah, thanks for a provoking talk, Josh. Is it possible, while everything that you've said to explain the failures of the synthesis sounds quite plausible, is it possible that enhanced sensitivity to certain kinds of sounds that we're really good at attending to, like speech and music, interferes with some of those examples as well?
Yeah, it might just be that we're kind of better at noticing the failures in the case of speech. That's certainly plausible, and I certainly don't want to claim that the synthetic rain is physically indistinguishable from real rain. It's probably just perceptually indistinguishable, right? So that could well be part of it. But the fact remains that the point is that because these things sound so different to us, our brain's got to be measuring something that is sensitive to that difference, right? And so that's still something that we need to try to understand. So yeah, I think the gap may be bigger there because of the fact that we're more attuned to it, but we still need to try to understand what it is that's more attuned.
Okay, one last question here.
Thank you. I have a question regarding the synthesis part. When you talk about impose the statistics, while we learn the dependency, how are these dependency being imposed into the statistics during the synthesis?
So I didn't really talk about this in great detail, but it's gradient descent. So if I can get back to the flow chart here, here's somewhere. So each of the statistics is an analytic function of the envelopes, right? And so like, take the variance, for instance, right? How do you compute the variance? Well, you have the squared deviation between the envelope and its mean averaged over time, right? So that's just a function. You can compute the partial derivative of that function with respect to one sample of the envelope. And if you have that whole list of partial derivatives, well, that's the gradient. And the gradient has the property that if you move in that direction, it'll increase the value of the statistic, right? That's the definition of the gradient. And so you can compute the gradient of every statistic with respect to a particular envelope, and then just move in a direction that gets the statistics to where you want them to be. And of course, there's all the associated problems of gradient descent in that there can be local minima and so forth. And so we do something a little bit more sophisticated, but that's the basic idea.
Okay, so we should now break for the coffee break. We have the opportunity to talk with our speakers during that time, so feel free to follow us downstairs for a little snack.